So good morning, everyone. And for those of us joining us from the other side of the world, good evening and welcome to Independent Media in Modi's India, a conversation with Siddharth Varadarajan. Thank you for joining us. It is an undeniable fact that an independent media is central to the practice of democracy. The Fourth Estate has the unique responsibility of holding the other branches of government accountable in the eyes of the public. And it is this responsibility that is increasingly forsaken in modern India to a sometimes fatal degree. Its knock-on impacts on both democracy and to the health of public discourse are apparent. A consolidated media subservient to oligarchic interests is capable of, as Dewey put it, sowing, quote, hate in place of understanding. Today, we're privileged to have in the room with us someone on the front lines of that battle against disinformation, polarization, and media consolidation. Siddharth Varadarajan is the founding editor of The Wire, one of India's few independent media outlets. Previously, he was editor of The Hindu. An economist by training, he studied at the London School of Economics and Columbia University and taught at New York University before returning to India to work as a journalist. He has been a visiting lecturer at the Journalism School at the University of California, Berkeley, and a Poynter Fellow at Yale University. On behalf of the Center of Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, and the Center for South Asia at Stanford, we're thrilled to have the chance to welcome him to Stanford virtually today. Welcome, Dr. Varadarajan. This talk will consist of two segments. First, a guided discussion, and then open questions and answers from the audience. During the talk, we do ask that you please keep your mics muted. Let's kick things off with our first question. Dr. Varadarajan, many have dubbed press freedom in India as a rapidly deteriorating ecosystem, given political pressure and media consolidation. As the founder of one among India's few independent media outlets today, and as a former editor of a major newspaper in the pre-Modi era, you're in a unique position to comment on how the situation for press freedoms and for free journalism has changed. What are the most salient changes occurring in this landscape from your perspective? And to what extent do you feel they're reversible after this government inevitably leaves power?
Okay. Thank you very much for that question, Abeer, and for organizing this interaction. I'm, never, and I'm never reluctant to engage with people in India or abroad on the state of Indian journalism, because it's an issue that concerns me deeply, troubles me deeply, and I do feel that wider conversations need to be held on this, because there's a lot of lack of awareness of the true extent to which free media in India is imperiled. The assumption is that India, being the world's largest democracy, quote unquote, would have robust media, but sadly that's not the case. It hasn't been the case, and here I'm trying to answer your question. It hasn't been the case for quite some time now. There has been a disconnect between India's status as a democracy in the eyes of the world, and in a formal sense too, with regular elections, multi-party system, and so on and so forth, and the reality of media functioning. As you know, in any market-driven society, media is a business by and large, right? It's owned by private players who run media for profit. Some are more greedy than others, some are more ambitious than others, but by and large, it remains a private enterprise that is intended to bring some kind of return for its owners. And this essence of media in any market-driven society creates a complexity, because somewhere down the line, the pursuit of profit and the pursuit of journalistic standards and rigor and integrity come into conflict. It isn't inevitable that media in market-driven societies will be debased or will be bad or will be unethical. There are many examples of market-driven societies which have robust independent media. Sadly, India is not one of them. And one of the reasons for this, I think, has to do with the peculiarity of the political economy of the media in India, where the role played by advertising and other sources of revenue in the overall business model of media owners is to the tune of 85 to 90% sometimes, maybe even more. And the amount that readers or viewers themselves pay is a very small fraction, perhaps 5%, 10%. And in any business model driven by revenue sources which are, which comprise advertisers, investors, and let's not forget that the government is itself a very big advertiser. The deck of cards is stacked against media freedom, because at the end of the day, it's largely the reader and the viewer who has a vested interest in ensuring that her source of news is independent and unbiased and is actually speaking the truth. Advertisers have other interests, investors have other interests. And this hasn't been too much of a problem in the West because some kind of a balance has been struck. So in the US, for example, roughly 50-50 would be a fair guess as to how much advertising income generates and how much reader revenue generates. In India, that balance is 95-5 or 90-10 in favor of advertising. So I think the business model itself is problematic and broken. And I think lends itself to illegitimate pressure from the government. When investors or the owners of media have multiple business interests and they are worried about their bottom lines, and they need to pay attention to their relationship with government, particularly in a highly regulated economy like India's, where the government, despite the 1991 reforms, calls a lot of shots still and can make life difficult for investors or business people, right? So when you have a business model which drives the media that is dependent on investors who are in turn, quite dependent on what the government thinks of them, this is a recipe for disaster. And the fact that the checks and balances, those institutions that are meant to safeguard democratic governance and ensure that the executive branch doesn't violate its prerogatives. When those institutions and checks and balances are weak or underdeveloped or compromised, this creates an added layer of vulnerability for the media. So in India, a business house which owns media has to worry about what the government thinks about its coverage, because the government can hurt its business interest, and the government can be vindictive, and the doors on which in any democracy you would expect to be able to knock in order to get redressal for your grievances against, say, the abuse of power, those doors are not responsive to you in the way that they ought to be. To put it very crudely, I don't think at the height of Donald Trump's depredations and invective and abuse against the US media, the owners of the New York Times or CNN or NBC or CBS ever feared the midnight knock of the Inland Revenue Service or the FBI or any US federal agency. And were such a knock to have come about, they would be reasonably confident that even a city level or a state level court would give them redress.
Absolutely.
In India, that's not the case. In India, Pranoy Roy, the proprietor of NDTV, had to deal with the CBI landing up at his door at 6 a.m, investigating a bogus 10-year-old case. And he hasn't been able to leave the country for the last 4 or 5 years because of that so-called investigation. such is the power of the Indian state, and such is the weakness of institutions that are meant to safeguard the ordinary citizen. I'm not even talking of the media here. Safeguard the ordinary citizen's rights against the excessive use of state authority, right? So in this terrain, in this legal, institutional, political economy terrain, which has always been bad and has always acted as a problem for the media, when you have a party in power that believes in a take no prisoners approach, believes in full spectrum dominance, believes that anybody who isn't singing your praises is your enemy, and is not just your enemy, but is an ally of Pakistan, an ally of China, funded by some international conspiracy. When you have this kind of mindset in power, then you can imagine that the terrain for media freedom can get very, very difficult. And that's precisely what we've seen play out over the last 6 or 7 years. I can give you many examples of the specific kind of pressures, but that's broadly speaking, the terrain that I wanted your audience to be familiar with.
Right. We all recognize the value that independent journalism brings to the table in terms of its ability to hold public figures accountable. But obviously, not every case can warrant the dedication of those limited resources that an independent news organization almost by default has to work with. And The Wire, of course, sources its own news stories directly from a network of field reporters, as opposed to completely relying on press agencies such as ANI or the Associated Press to do the majority of reportage for it. How do you prioritize as a news editor which stories to pursue and eventually run, especially when faced with those kinds of tight resource constraints? Which ones are the highest impact stories in your experience?
No, that's a great question, because for us, The Wire and its founding was driven by this idea that if we want to make a break with the existing media structures with all their problems and vulnerabilities, we have to pioneer and think of a new business model. Mm-hmm. And that business model was, to put it very simply, one which said, we are going to bet on the willingness of the ordinary citizen, the reader, to pay for the journalism that we provide. Mm-hmm. So today, after 7 years, and our 7th anniversary is coming up on May the 11th, roughly 80% of our monthly operating expenses comes from reader donations, which is very high, I don't think anybody else in India is able to generate those kinds of, that kind of a response from their readers and viewers.
Certainly a far cry from the 90% figures that you cited.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if Times of India and even the Hindu earns 90% of its revenue from advertising and 10% from cover price, mm-hmm. We are 80%, not subscriptions, but donations. Mm-hmm. And the reason these are donations and not subscriptions is because as a nonprofit with tax exempt status, these are donations and not something that we're giving. So there's no quid pro quo with the donor, right? These are pure donations, right? So they're not subscriptions. And The Wire is free to read, and there's no paywall, and we will not put up a paywall because we believe that the work we do needs to reach the widest number of people. But your question has to do with the selection of news. And for us, our task is kind of, the news kind of selects itself, because on any given day, any self-respecting news editor knows what the important developments are. Mm-hmm. 90% of Indian media goes off in one direction, focusing on issues that are of priority to the government, and will ignore issues that are of concern to ordinary people. Topics that ought to inform primetime discussion are ignored week after week. Mm-hmm. Instead, all kinds of random topics, usually designed to fuel hatred against minorities, say, or to fuel a certain jingoistic sense of nationalism and so on. Those topics are injected into public discourse with the collusion of big media. So it's quite easy for us to know, to make those decisions that on any given day, what are the kind of stories that we're going to focus on, and what are the issues that we are going to emphasize. So but yeah, there are difficult choices that we need to make in terms of deploying reporting resources. When you're funded by readers and you're on a tight budget, we have a fraction of the resources of big newspapers or television channels. So we have to make those difficult decisions, that today, do we commission that extra story from Jammu Kashmir or Assam, or do we send a reporter to travel to some place in Uttar Pradesh to get a certain story? So, our colleagues are always, so we have a discussion every morning where we figure out where we want to prioritize our coverage, where we think we can be most effective. And invariably, what tends to swing our decision is if a story is being grossly neglected by the rest of the media. So the farmers' protest, everybody covered it in the initial weeks. And then big media forgot about it or reduced the farmers' protest to a traffic problem. My colleagues took the view that we need to stick with the story.
Yeah.
We need to report what's happening. We need to follow the ins and outs of the debates and discussions that were happening. So if you look at the Wire's coverage, we never really tuned out or zoned out of the farmers' protest. We stuck with it, of course, to greater or lesser intensity of coverage, depending on what was happening in terms of specific events. But we stayed with the story, and I dare say the government's decision to finally give in to what the farmers were demanding was a vindication of our sense that this was not a story which was over, simply because big media decided it was over, simply because the government decided it was over. We said, no, the story still has legs. We need to cover it. And Kashmir is another area that we believe is very, very important for us. And I have maybe 2 or 3, 4 reporters, freelance reporters who write regularly for The Wire, whom we have worked closely with over the last 4 or 5 years. We have a good relationship of trust, because we feel that what's happening in Kashmir should not be invisibilized by the rest of India. The rest of India assumes that what the government did on August the 5th, 2019, with the reading down of Article 370, marked some kind of a silver bullet that got rid of all the problems in the region. But hey, they had problems galore. Those problems got worse. And we need to report what's happening. So for us, on any given week, Kashmir, I'd have 2 or 3 stories a week, maybe more, compared to other parts of India, because that's an editorial call that we've taken.
Yeah.
So I would say, in a nutshell, underreported, neglected areas tend to become something that we would consider a priority, and where we then say that we need to try to devote resources there. Of course, there are certain things that you have to cover because those are new election campaigns, for example, or an important international conference, or things that are happening on the diplomatic or military, on the military calendar. You cover those. So the major national, international news will find its reflection in The Wire, but we try to focus special attention on areas that are neglected by others.
Right. And that onus of sort of going against the grain when it comes to the narrative setting, which is sort of the main use, I would say, of a consolidated media, that's certainly something that we see in The Wire's reporting, and that's certainly something that readers find to be one of the most valuable things about reading The Wire. The question of funding that you raised goes hand in hand with the question of media freedom, of course. One cannot have a truly free media if it's dependent on politically entrenched interests to keep the lights on. And you discussed donations. You at The Wire are funded through donations, ad revenue, and grants by means of an NGO that's called the Foundation for Independent Journalism. What are some challenges that you've faced in keeping the lights on and competing with the likes of these corporate media powerhouses with the conglomerate parent company funds? We had, for example, Ravish Kumar come to Stanford a couple of years ago, and he was speaking about NDTV basically being boycotted and choked out of advertising revenue. And so to what extent have you seen that sort of collusive behavior happening with The Wire? How does that affect you? And how does that affect your operations?
The Wire was fortunate to receive 1 year into its founding the support of a Bangalore-based philanthropic foundation called the Independent Public Spirited Media Foundation that was set up by a number of public spirited business persons, Azim Premji, Kiran Mazumdar Shaw, Rohini Nilekani, and others. And the grants that we received, I think over a period of 4 years, helped to put us on the map for sure. We launched The Wire in 2015 with virtually no money and received our first grant from the IPSMF in 2016. And that allowed us to scale up, although we'd already made an impact, but that allowed us to scale up. We launched The Wire Hindi. We were able to do a lot more on video. We launched The Wire Urdu. And generally were able to magnify our presence with that kind of support. IPSMF was very clear from the outset that they would be with us for only a short duration, that their goal was to help us to get off the ground. And they instilled in us from day one a sense that we needed to start looking for other sources of revenue. So we would knock on other doors, philanthropic doors, and reach some measure of success until we did a big story in 2017 on the business affairs of Amit Shah's son. And shortly after that story broke, the kind of pressure that was mounted by government ministers on some of those individuals who had either donated or committed to donating or were in discussions with us about donating, a lot of pressure was mounted on those doors. And it became harder and harder for us to secure philanthropic funding beyond what the IPSMF in Bangalore was providing us. So we began to realize that we were in a tricky situation where funding from the IPSMF was tapering off as it was designed to. But other philanthropic doors were not being opened as we had hoped they might be. And that's when we said, look, we had begun The Wire with this premise that readers are going to want to back us, and let's be more aggressive in our crowdfunding. So roughly around this time, 2017, we began to make more persistent, earnest appeals to our readers. And gradually were able to grow what readers were giving from 5 or 6 lakhs a month to what is currently an average of anywhere from 25 to 30 lakhs a month that comes in from reader donations. Mm-hmm. And we also, had for our videos and for our website programmatic ads that Google or YouTube, provides. We don't market them, but Google or YouTube automatically assigns them, and that brings in a certain amount of revenue. And we do some marketing. Karan Thapar's show, for example, we were able to find a sponsor for some time. So we do all right, but I would be lying if I were to say that there isn't pressure on potential sponsors, potential donors. There's a lot of pressure. Many of these people that we speak to are quite open and blunt about it, saying that they can't afford to alienate the government at this time. And we understand. I mean, we don't make a big song and dance about it because that's the terrain, that's the reality. And what Ravish told you was absolutely right. we know, and we have plenty of anecdotal evidence of big private advertisers being leaned on by government agencies and told not to advertise on NDTV. We've heard stories of this. And the converse is also true. Huh? I mean, channels that are really, really bad and which engage in openly communal programming. There's a channel called Sudarshan TV, for example.
Yeah.
In the so-called news channel, which is a blatant organ or a vehicle for anti-Muslim propaganda, day in and day out. They get advertising from a whole bunch of private companies. They get advertising from the Uttar Pradesh government. I believe I've seen central government, different ministries putting ads there. So that's the way it works, right? I mean, now this is taxpayer money, right? If we're talking of UP government or central government advertising, public advertising, this is taxpayer money. And I think it's good if taxpayer money is used to pay for advertising on the media. That's a good thing because media needs to be supported. But surely this can't be in a democracy on the basis of partisanship, right? Government should not be able to get away with giving public money, taxpayers' money, to channels which are communal, channels which promote its political agenda, and then starve those channels or those newspapers that are critical of the government. That's not the way public money has to be spent in a democracy. So yeah, so economic penalties are a fact of life for media that is critical, and economic benefits are par for the course for media that toes the line. And this is also served to debase the media landscape in some way, so that it's become harder and harder for independent, critical, professional journalism to survive and flourish. And that's why one of the reasons why in the latest RSF report, India has fallen from 142 to 150, eight places in 1 year.
Yeah.
And I'm not even I haven't begun to talk about all the other kinds of pressure, like criminal cases, etc., which are also regrettably a part of the landscape.
Yeah. And I believe that's the 7th straight year that we've had declines in our World Press Freedom rankings. Exactly. We used to rank somewhere around the 70 mark, I believe, in 2014, 2015, and now we're at 150 out of 180, which is quite concerning to say the least. If you go off on a slightly more different tangent, and if you explore maybe more experimental kinds of funding, Stanford, of course, is known for our startup culture and our venture capital ecosystem. And students over here receive funding to pursue a lot of different sorts of projects, many of which fall under the unconventional plethora or the unconventional umbrella of different ideas. Do you think students could leverage these sorts of non-traditional modes of raising capital, such as through the startup route, to get involved with the independent journalism in their home countries?
Yeah, I think absolutely. The Wire is a little bit different because as a nonprofit, there is really no scope for venture capital, startup capital, or any kind of investment, right? In fact, because of the because of the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act in India, we only accept donations from Indian citizens or Indian citizens overseas. So Indian citizens who, what are called NRIs, so people who still have an Indian passport, even if they live abroad. Anybody who doesn't have an Indian passport is legally we are not allowed to accept donations from them, right? So if you set aside the Wire as one exemplar of independent media and look at other entities, there are lots of smaller media outlets or independent websites. As News Laundry, there's Scroll. There are websites, there's News Minute in the South. There are websites in Tamil, Bengali, Kannada, Gujarati, Vibes of India from Ahmedabad, which are more conventionally structured. So they are essentially private limited companies. And I dare say that the young graduates from Stanford or other universities in the US ought to seriously look at ways in which capital could be raised for independent media. One caveat though, the Modi government in 2019, I believe, or 2020, amended the rules governing foreign direct investment to put a cap on permissible foreign investment in digital media. That cap is at 26%. Moreover, the government decided that FDI in digital media would need to be approved by the government on a case-to-case basis. So India has a lot of what are called FDI approvals by the automatic route. In other words, once the government decides that a certain sector is open to foreign investment, then FDI approvals are, automatic. For digital media, they have said that it will be on a case-to-case basis, which means that a young, bunch of kids from Palo Alto decide that we want to put together a fund to help, independent media in India, right? Invest. You have, for example, in New York, right? There's the Media Development, MDIF, Media Development Investment Fund. I don't know. Yeah, I think that's what it stands for. But MDIF, right? It's patient capital. They have invested in, I think the Mail and Guardian in South Africa, Malaysia Kini in Malaysia. They've invested in Scroll. So kids in Palo Alto want to create a new vehicle of that kind, like MDIF, and say that we want to identify and give seed capital for, say, digital media in different Indian languages, right? We want to help Hindi, Kashmiri, Marathi websites, create platforms like The Wire, but in many, many different languages. The first obstacle you would hit would be this case-to-case approval by the government. So assuming the 26% FDI cap is not a deal breaker, you would not be able to get your foot into the door unless the government of India says we allow this investment to happen. So in that sense, the GOI, these guys are quite smart. They look at what Russia has tried, Hungary, China, and are coming up with kind of clever design that is not a blanket ban, but where the climate is such that you deter independent journalism. Like the most recent decision, right? It doesn't concern the media strictly, but just last week, a government agency told VPN providers that you can only operate in India if you keep a log of every website that every customer visits, and you keep that log for 5 years. Now, many of these guys don't even maintain logs because the key
antithetical to the mission of a VPN.
Exactly, of a VPN, right? So, and I think NordVPN, one of the big VPN guys, says that we'd rather pack up and leave. So, pursuant to the new FDI rule, we know that Yahoo News India has shut shop. We know that Huffington Post India shut shop rather than comply with the new FDI rules. But that's so there's a design to this, so the idea is that you say, no, we're making rules, we're making everything transparent. Even when the FDI rules were introduced for digital, the government said that we are doing this to encourage investment in digital media, whereas prior to the rule coming in, there was no cap. So obviously, if you have no cap and no government permission, what could be a more enabling environment for FDI in digital media? But the government said, no, we're going to introduce a cap and we're going to introduce permission. So I think what would be useful is for people at Stanford or elsewhere to pay attention to because this isn't, by the way, a purely Indian problem. Huh? I mean, even in the US, how will media pay for itself? It's, not everybody has the brand recognition of the New York Times. Not everybody has the niche value of The Economist. So how do you if you're a startup, how do you generate enough heft and traction to get off the ground, right? And I think that finding ways to provide seed capital, this is central to, I think, how we envision ourselves as a democracy, right? Because unless you have a variety of voices in media, and unless you have media that's looking at a whole bunch of areas, and not just those areas which the market considers profitable, somehow you're going to be impoverishing democracy, right? So there is a sense in which trying to come up with ways of raising money to fund independent media also becomes an act of strengthening democracy, strengthening transparency. And this isn't something that's unique to India. I think the US needs it. I think any democracy has to reckon with this problem.
Absolutely. Another term we love to use in Silicon Valley is return on equity. You run an incredibly lean organization by all accounts with relatively sparse funding, as we've already talked about, but with one of the best records of truthful reporting in the Indian press. Lest I be accused of bias, over this past 6 going on 7 years of operation, The Wire has almost never had to retract reported stories. As far as I know, never has occurred even once. Neither has it been the frequent subject of fact checks by Indian vetting agencies. In a time where misinformation dominates, what are some of the guiding principles that you as an editor issue to your journalists to ensure quality reporting?
Yeah, no, we're very proud of our track record. And it's not that errors don't get made, but I think the key to dealing with errors is to spot them early, be transparent, and address them quickly, and address them transparently. So we are one of the few publications in India that our desk is mandated, and we stipulate that when a story is corrected, any major editing is undertaken after the story is published. And that could be for a variety of reasons, right? The story may be updated, maybe it's a developing story, or maybe a certain fact was wrong, or maybe there was an error of interpretation that led to a wrong headline. That needs to be recorded as a note at the end of the story. That is the minimum amount of transparency that publications owe their readers.
Right.
And if and when you, right now we've never been in a situation where we've had to retract a story, but we've had to take down a few stories because of court orders, injunctions that we believe were unfairly granted and we are contesting. In one case, 2 stories of ours by the BJP MP Rajiv Chandrasekhar about him were taken down pursuant to a court injunction, but we challenged the injunction, won a reversal of that order. So the stories are back up again. But right now, 14 of our stories were injuncted by Bharat Biotech, which is the maker of Covaxine. And so we've complied with the court order. Of course, those stories are available on websites elsewhere. We have no control over that. So it's not as if they can't be found. But we've complied with the court order, and we are vigorously contesting the injunction, and we are confident that we will win. But the key to credibility, I think, is to be open when errors, big or small, are made, acknowledge them. And we also have an added layer, which is again quite unique to the Indian media landscape, which is that we have a public editor. And I think we call her an ombudsperson, who is not a Wire employee. She's appointed by the Wire's editorial, by the Foundation for Independent Journalism, and as it happens, she is pro bono, so she doesn't draw a salary from us either. And we undertake to publish her column in which she deals with assessments of our coverage based on reader feedback and reader criticism, without any changes on our part. So in other words, we run a bunch of stories, readers write into the public editor and say, well, we have XYZ issues with those stories. The public editor may put some of those questions to us. Why did you do this in such and such way? And
Mhm.
will form her opinion, and she will write her opinion, and we are obligated to publish it without revision. And so the Guardian in the UK, the Asahi Shimbun in Japan, the New York Times used to have a public editor. I think they got rid of her. But this is I think a very good institution which gives readers an avenue to raise issues of substantial concern. There could be factual, there could be interpretive, could be allegations of bias,
Mhm.
and have them addressed by somebody who is a professional journalist, who is aware of the ethos of the news organization, but who is not part of the editorial chain of command. So she doesn't report to us. We can't, we can't correct or change what she says. And I think that
Mhm.
it's these layers of transparency that have allowed the Wire to occupy the position it has today, where despite being a news platform that many people believe, and certainly the government does,
Mhm.
believe is critical of the establishment,
Mhm.
and we are reviled by the members of the ruling party and so on and so forth, but they take us very, very seriously. And what we write and report, I'll give you an example of. The other day we ran a story based on a Supreme Court. The Supreme Court pulled up the Tamil Nadu governor recently, the
Mhm.
office of the Tamil Nadu governor, for sending a mercy petition in the Rajiv Gandhi assassination case to the president
Mhm.
instead of taking a decision himself.
Mhm.
And now this pertained to a referral that the governor had made in 2018,
Mhm.
when I think either Mr. Rosaiya or Mr. Banwarilal Purohit was the governor of Tamil Nadu.
Mhm.
But our desk, while publishing the story, assumed that the governor was the current incumbent,
Mhm.
which is Mr. R.N. Ravi, who was in any case fighting with the Tamil Nadu government. So they used his photograph and put his name as the governor. And within, I think, 15 minutes of the story going up, I got a call from the governor's office on special duty saying, "Look, I think you guys have made a mistake.
Mhm.
And can you look into it, please?" And I immediately opened the story and I realized what had happened.
Mhm.
And we, made the correction, put in a note. And so I think, like if we were seen by the establishment as a website that lacks credibility, that publishes any old rubbish,
Mhm.
then nobody bothers to make a correction, right? The assumption is that everything we're doing is fake news, so-called fake
Yeah.
news. And why bother, right? But I
Yeah.
think that what we've done, we managed to create space for ourselves. And I think this is a rare accomplishment because, we are a feisty little platform that, believes in being objective, honest. And if there's an error, we're happy to acknowledge it and, and carry on. So, but as I said, there's no, as you noticed, there's been no retraction of any story. There hasn't been any major issue of that kind. But I
Mhm.
think, and we are also part of the RSF, which does the country ranking. They have something
Mhm.
called the Journalism Trust Initiative, where media houses are encouraged to be transparent about ownership, about sources of revenue, about editorial standards, and so on and so forth, and to so in other words, to conform to a certain benchmark and also be audited by an
Mhm.
external agency to the extent to which you are conforming to that benchmark. So we are kind of 3/4 of the process through of conforming to that transparent benchmark, and we hope to be audited and certified as
Mhm.
being a fully paid up member of the Journalism Trust Initiative. And I think more and more media houses ought to do that.
And just a quick question, Dr. Varadarajan, how many of the sort of mainstream media outlets are you aware of that are also currently seeking this certification?
Not many.
Mhm.
I think that could also be because it's quite new and is perhaps not well publicized. I know that RSF reached out to a number of media organizations, But the main reason that big media will avoid it is because not many of them want to be transparent about, even if they're transparent about sources of ownership, because these are all, largely privately held, family-owned companies. But they would be reluctant to be transparent about sources of revenue.
Right.
And, even something so basic as, tell us who your major advertisers are. And, I can understand why in a fiercely competitive market, why many media organizations may be unwilling to do that. So I'm not judging them, but I do feel that given the credibility of the media and the fact that readers, we need to be working to have the readers trust good media.
Yeah.
And there is, I do not subscribe to the conceit that The Wire is the only, we are one of, several media organizations in India that are, standing up for standards, but there are others. So I'm hoping that we can create a small ecosystem of media that's not just non-profit like ourselves, but also privately owned, that is willing to stand up and be counted as far as, being transparent to the highest possible degree as a means of reinforcing public trust in the media.
Right.
And so I'm hopeful that in the next year or two, more people will adhere to the JTI, the Journalism Trust Initiative of the RSF or its equivalent.
And in the spirit of transparency, we'll now move quickly into our second segment, which is open question and answers from our audience. Please enter your questions in the chat and we'll call out on you, and you can go ahead and ask your question to Dr. Varadarajan. We understand that we've gone a little bit over time, but since we started a bit late, we can probably afford ourselves a little bit of extra leeway. So please do send in your questions in the chat and we'll call on you. Yes, so the first question is from Professor Bigelow. You can go ahead and ask you can unmute yourself. Perfect.
Hi, I'm Anna Bigelow. I'm here faculty in religious studies and also the director of the Center for South Asia. So thank you for joining us. Also a fan of your feisty little news outlet, as you called it. So a regular reader. So a couple things. One, you referenced briefly earlier, and this is something I've been really curious about, is the degree to which the sort of lawsuits and nuisance cases around defamation have been coming to your reporters or to your to the whole paper, to the whole outlet, and how you're managing that. I'm sure that's a lot of time and energy and cost involved, as well as perhaps also has a chilling effect on some of your reporters and the kinds of stories that they want to do. There's a lot of discussion about how this whole climate creates a chilling effect on the kinds of topics that people are willing to invest in and to do sustained, engaged research or comprehensive reporting on. So I'm curious how that's affected your choices internally, and how much of a challenge it is to manage that. And then the other question is how, again, in this climate, are you seeing young reporters coming along and helping to cultivate them in this space, to give them voices? How are you identifying new reporters coming up that might not just be sucked into the machines of the industry, but invest their energies in what's probably a lot less remunerative, but is perhaps has its other rewards in independent media?
Great. Thank you. Thank you for those questions. I'll take the first one first. Defamation cases have been the traditional form of trying to intimidate media. Slap suits, I think you call them in America. And in India, we are burdened not just by the plain vanilla civil defamation suit, in which the worst that can happen is that you're asked to pay money as damages, but we also have criminal defamation. So we are one of the few democracies that still retains criminal defamation on its statute books, which means that a politician or a business person can hope to send you to jail for the so-called crime of defamation and not just extract damages from you. Now, it's a different matter that very few of these cases ever get prosecuted to that level where you have conviction or even the imposition of damages. But the main purpose of these cases is to harass, intimidate, and to have that chilling effect that you mentioned. So at the Wire, we have, I think we are facing currently maybe 10 or 11 civil and criminal defamation cases. The first case was filed back in, I think, 2016 or 2017 by a BJP MP. And we have another case filed by Mr. Amit Shah's son, the Home Minister's son. These have been pending for the last six or 7 years. The most recent case was filed a month and a half ago. And the idea is to tie you down in paperwork, court appearances, reviewing court briefs and petitions and counter petitions and so on and so forth. And it is a pain. I mean, more than the expenses, which are onerous but not prohibitively so, because we have pro bono. Our lead counsel is pro bono, and but yeah, I mean, entering appearances in courts around the country, there is a significant cost involved. But it's the headache of reviewing drafts and petitions and so on and so forth that takes us away from the task of journalism. So this is a very concrete problem, compounded by the fact that over the last 2 years, BJP state governments in Uttar Pradesh and elsewhere have hit upon the idea of filing criminal charges against media outlets for stories that they do. So now we do not just have to contend with a defamation case, but there is the additional headache of dealing with criminal charges and the police knocking on your door, trying to arrest you, trying to take you in for questioning for pieces of journalism. So stories that in the as recently as 3 or 4 years ago, at best the government would issue a denial or issue a strong statement saying that this is all false or whatever, can now result in the police filing fairly serious criminal cases. So I myself, I think I'm facing 4 or 5 criminal cases in Uttar Pradesh. And I have you mentioned young reporters. I have two young reporters in their first job, Ismat Ara and Siraj Ali, who have had to deal with, and Mukul Singh, 3 of them, sorry, who've had to deal with criminal charges being filed against them. Now you can imagine, I'm a kind of grizzly old guy. I've been there, seen that. These things don't faze me, right? But a 23-year-old kid, a 25-year-old kid just out of college doing their first media job, all excited, and having to deal with this headache of, a police case and the parents freaking out. So yeah, there's a lot of, there is a chilling effect. There's an attempt to intimidate and cause panic. And I can only applaud and admire the sentiment of young reporters who do not appear to be unfazed by this and still want to, in the course of a typical year, I speak to maybe 9 or 10 journalism departments in different colleges around the country and speak to students about to graduate or in the middle of their programs. And they're all enthusiastic about wanting to go out there, even though the terrain is pretty rotten, as I described to you. 90% of places that you would end up working at are pretty shitty. But they still feel that they have something to contribute, they want to do things. And thankfully, digital technology and digital journalism gives reporters much greater latitude and freedom to be able to do things on their own or to do things on a lower budget. So I think, these cases have not deterred, as far as I can see, young people from wanting to enter what I still believe is a great profession. And, today in virtually every state in India, you have, you have several dozen freelance reporters who eke out a very precarious living, but are committed to reporting stories that, will shine a light on what's happening around them. And so this is a very positive thing, that defamation cases and criminal cases have not managed to deter yet, and I don't think they will. So a lot depends on the media organizations themselves, how resolutely they face up to this challenge. The idea is to wear you down with harassment. And as long as you take a decision that you're not going to be worn down, you can cope with this kind of harassment. But it's this escalation by filing criminal cases that's a problem. One of India's most respected editors, Mrinal Pandey, she was the first woman editor of a national daily, Hindustan, and she's a well-known and highly regarded writer, commentator. The Delhi police 2 years ago charged her with sedition because she tweeted that a young farmer who had died during the farmers' protest in Delhi had been killed by a bullet injury rather than an accident, as the police claimed. You could say that there was a dispute about the facts. Maybe the police is right. But how does that become a sedition case? And if Mrinal Pandey, who is this storied name in Indian journalism, if an attempt can be made to intimidate her and file a sedition case in the capital city, you can imagine the kind of terrain that's been prepared for less well-known reporters in distant parts of the Republic. So yeah, this legal threats are real, but we need to stare them down.
Wonderful. If there aren't any further questions, I did have a final question actually about the topic of sensationalism. The genre of yellow journalism is often referred to as sort of an arms race all the way down, in that once you start broadcasting highly sensationalized, poorly sourced stories, so do your competitors until it becomes sort of an industry-wide contagion. To what extent do you believe that India's media landscape has become sensationalized in this way? And how do you compete with news media that prioritizes that style and that volume over substance? I ask since some may argue, and I've heard several people argue, that India needs more of sort of a liberal Fox News type of outlet as opposed to a liberal New York Times to fight mudslinging sort of in kind. And I don't necessarily agree with that opinion, but I'm intrigued to hear what you would think.
There's been a race to the bottom for some time, driven largely by the failure to recognize the difference between reporting and editorializing. You can have channels or newspapers that represent different editorial or political, affiliations or points of view, but those should not be allowed to leach into or contaminate their reporting. But sadly, and this is true particularly of television, a lot of what passes for reporting is actually highly editorialized commentary, where facts are distorted or not presented as facts, or facts are simply not presented. What's presented are opinions, judgments, name calling. The use of hashtags has proliferated in the middle of news programs. Studio guests who are invited to give a particular opinion have a label slapped on them, which flattens out any possibility of nuance. And this is what it is now. I mean, you have a situation where, I don't watch Fox News in America, and I have a vague sense of what it puts out. But we have several channels that are referred to as the Indian version of Fox. So I don't think India suffers from the absence of quote unquote Fox type channels. In fact, they seem to be the norm. And they compete with each other in the pursuit of, defending the government's agenda, promoting Islamophobia, promoting hatred of Bangladesh, like the neighboring countries, xenophobia, so on and so forth. And so this is, I think that they do compete with each other because, as I said, the government directs advertising revenue, not only its own money, but also with a nudge and a wink, private advertisers to those channels that it believes are towing its agenda the most faithfully. So a lot of what we see, this race to the bottom, is actually a race to see who can be the most loyal sycophant and supporter of the government, because there are very concrete economic benefits, financial benefits that are linked to having that kind of proximity to those in power. So much as we would like to think of this as moral debasement, which it is, of course, this is again tied to your, it's an illustration of your business, of your broken business model, where proprietors are not bothered about what viewers think or what readers want, but are looking to curry favor with those in power because they know that's what's going to bring the greatest degree of profit. And so yellow journalism is not a phenomena that is out there, independent of political economy, independent of political processes in society. It's very much integral and linked to the staying power of that political economy and the staying power of those political forces. They need yellow journalism to make their case,
right?
And that's essentially what we are seeing today.
And do you think that there's a potential for that sector to be disrupted by following a business model that prioritizes what readers think, say a for-profit profit model?
Absolutely. But I think that business model is already being disrupted because you have today, thanks to digital, you have so many professional journalists who have turned to YouTube and make videos, sort of one-woman channels, one-man channels. They hit the road, they bring stories from the ground. And now, of course, a lot of it can be unreliable if we're looking at stuff that's not properly fact-checked and so on. But you have enough credible names of journalists who have oodles of experience on broadcast news or newspapers who are saying, well, I'm not going to be part of this rotten system. I'm going to try to take my journalism direct to people. So there is plenty of scope, I think, for digital journalism. And digital journalism that, could very well be profitable, because if it has viewership, it will get advertising. If it has viewership, it can get donations. So I think there is every scope. I am hugely optimistic, because when I look at ourselves, 7 years, 42 employees, and the kind of reach that we managed to have, the kind of impact that we've had on public discourse, that tells you the power of course, independent journalism and the fact that we are non-profit on the one hand, but it also tells you the power of digital as a technological springboard, because we provided big tech doesn't get suborned by big government, right? And we don't know what Elon Musk is going to do, and we don't know, lots of uncertainties. But for all the faults of big tech, Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, all of these have allowed small operations like The Wire to reach very large audiences that would not have been available to people like us 10 years ago, right? So the bad has the good has the bad, but there is very definite space for people to challenge the broken, rotten, corrupt model of big media, and craft, institutions and platforms that can promote independent journalism and do so in a way that is remunerative. that can pay for itself. I think there is, I'm very, very optimistic that the future will see many, many examples of operations, big and small, that find ways to leverage the public's trust as a means of paying for the work they do, rather than the favors that the government wants to do you, or money that some advertiser or some investor wants to put because they want to make a quick buck.
So you would say that system is ultimately an unsustainable one, that it's bound to collapse into what you say is something that actually leverages organic viewer trust in the information that's being put out.
Yeah, I think what we are trying to do, it is sustainable. Because I think that if you win the trust of readers, either as subscribers if you have a subscription model, or donors if you have a donation model, or even as eyeballs for advertising if you have advertising sort of driven models. But as long as, I think the key is to not be overly dependent on any one source of revenue. I think once it's one company that is your biggest advertiser, or a government agency, or one investor who accounts for 80% of your bottom line, that's where the problem starts, right? Because these become very, very obvious conduits for pressure. So the more diverse your funding model is, the greater the likelihood that you can resist pressures that inevitably powerful people will try to exert. But I think as far as the conventional model, which is of the big investor, the family-owned, the corporate media, investors, etc., advertising, even that's going to hit a crisis, by the way, because the market has space for only so many of them.
Yeah.
And so there will be monopolization, consolidation. I'm not sure how long the current terrain will last, where you have literally dozens of 24/7 TV channels in India. Unless these are being kept alive by politically motivated vested interests.
Right.
But there is little market rationale for India to have 20 or 25 24/7 news channels in Hindi and English. It makes no sense.
And on that note, we are far beyond time, but it really just flies by when you're learning this much. I'd like to thank you once again, Dr. Varadarajan, for your time. We will be welcoming you to Stanford, hopefully in person fairly soon for another event. And we're very much looking forward to that. The recording of this event will be made online on CDDR on CSA's YouTube page, so please do look out for that. Once again, thank you very much for your time. It is past midnight there, but we really, really appreciate all the work that you do. And we can't wait to welcome you to campus.
Well, thank you for having me. Enjoyed this interaction. Cheers.
All right.
Bye-bye.